Hello, my name is Andres Ryan, and welcome to Resolve Debate. In this series, I'll explain to you basic debate concepts and then go on to provide examples, along with others, for how to execute these concepts at the highest level in some of the toughest debate rounds. Obviously, this lecture is about topicality, which is a test of whether the affirmative in any given round satisfies their inherent burden of being topical. You may have seen this referred to as a stock issue because it's a fundamental expectation that an affirmative has to meet in order to be debated in the first place. First, we have to discuss what is topicality. Essentially, topicality is saying that the model of debate that the app proposes is bad for debate writ large because it is less educational, harder, and less fair. Essentially, when it comes down to it, topicality is a question of models. It's a debate of whether to prefer your negative model or the affirmative's model or interpretation. Topicality is essentially structured into three parts. First is the interpretation, or what you think debates about this year's resolution should be, which by extension encompass some of the affirmatives you should be discussing. Under the interpretation, you should define at least one word, ideally multiple, so that the affirmative has to read more cards in the 2AC. Second is the violation, the reasons for why the affirmative is outside this year's resolution and your interpretation. Third are the standards. Think of this as a piece of offense that explains why violating your interpretation is bad and how it makes it impossible to be a negative under the AF's interpretation. Think of this under the cow pen analogy. Think of the pen itself as the interpretation that are the parameters of debate and keeps affirmatives inside the cow pens. Think of AFs like the cows themselves. If they're inside the cow pen, that's good. However, if they're outside the cow pen, you have no idea where they will be at any given time, and that's bad because if you lose your cows, that's an objectively bad thing. Thus, the standards are reasons why being in the cow pen itself is a good idea. Next are the standards and the pieces of offense that the negative needs to leverage to win. In the 1NC, you don't need to read all of these standards. Ideally, most of the time you just have limits and ground, but you can also have precision if you want. First is limits. The gist of this argument is that we need to keep limits on the resolution because these act as parameters that constrain our arguments and act as a sort of guiding force that produce the best and most productive debates. If not for limits, the affirmative could quite literally be anything. This is an intellectual property topic. Without topicality or the limits imposed by the resolution, the affirmative can read a federal job guarantee aff from last year, or even an artificial intelligence logistics aff from the NATO topic. That's exactly why the negative wouldn't know what to expect if not for the constraining force of limits. They're fundamentally expecting the affirmative to talk about intellectual property rights because the resolution is about IPR. That's why they prep key negative positions like the capitalism critique, the clog disadvantage, and patents bad. This leads us into the second argument and piece of offense that the negative will make under topicality, ground. They're essentially saying that the arguments that the neg has prepared against the resolution and the bucket of AFs that fall under it are not applicable to the AF and not applicable to the AFs that fall under their interpretation. They're saying because they were untopical, we had fewer things to say against this particular affirmative. If there's no debate, there's obviously no clash. Thus, the negative would not have a fair shot at winning under the AF's interpretation. Remember, these are negatives arguments that they'll want to leverage. Third, this isn't a very common impact, but you will see it sometimes. Oftentimes, you'll see it brought up in the block as a reason how and why to mitigate certain pieces of AF offense. It's called precision. The negative will argue that their evidence is the most legally precise, which in turn means it's the most predictable. If you're at camp researching evidence, you'll often look up the most premier and respected law journals from lawyers, judges, and experts in the field, and that's exactly how they'll have excellent qualifications and an intent to define. Essentially, not in complex debater talk, this means they have an intention to define certain terms or provide definitions. Conversely, an intent to exclude is pretty self-explanatory. It just means they're trying to bracket something out of those defined definitions. One key thing to remember in topicality debating is that it is very, very, very good to compare definitions against each other. For example, if your piece of evidence is from a district court judge, however, the AF's evidence is from an IPR blog, obviously yours is far more credible, and you'll want to harp on that. Because our qualifications are so much better than theirs, our evidence is more predictable and more precise, which means it can better guide debates about intellectual property rights. Next, let's look at an example of a 1C on T enforcement. You'll also see this read as T courts. Essentially, this just means that strengthening intellectual property has to be done through Congress rather than the courts. Essentially, this Christianopoly card is talking about how IPR protections must be done through Congress and that court action is irrelevant. The first part is obviously the interpretation, setting out that, quote, IPR protections are statutory or done through the courts. Next is a violation that explains that the F in 1EC cross-examination and the plaintext committed to being the courts. This means that they have obviously violated the interpretation set out under Christianopoly. Finally, you have the standards. Oftentimes, you won't see them clearly signposted as, quote, standards, but rather, quote, voting issue for limits and ground. This is just a red flag that you know immediately translates to standards. Here you have that the AF opens the floodgates to include a litany of unbeatable AFs like court decisions affirming status quo or funding for the USPTO. Here you have a mixture of both resulting in a limits explosion or a huge increase in the number of AFs coupled with a decrease in the number of positions in off case that you could actually read against affirmatives that violated your interpretation. Thus, as you can see here, your standards are essentially reasons why violating your interpretation is an inherently bad thing. Next, we have a 2AC on topicality. In response to all of the arguments I was explaining before, you'll need to respond and advance your own offense. It's about offense, offense, and offense. The first argument you'll make is something called we meet, that you do not violate their interpretation and that your affirmative falls under their model. The second sub-point of this argument, I guess you could phrase it as, is plaintext in a vacuum. If your plaintext quite literally says the United States federal government should strengthen intellectual property rights in either patents, trademarks, or copyrights, then you could say, we literally mentioned in the plaintext, therefore we meet. I would advise to not go for this in the 1AR and the 2AR, but it's an interesting trick to have in the 2AC that will definitely skew the block. Next is a counterinterpretation. Just as the 1C provided cards explaining or rather defining words in this year's resolution, you'll need to do the same. However, one thing that you have to remember is to redefine the same words that were defined in the 1C. If you don't redefine those words, you will instantly lose against any good team because you'll point out that they dropped our definitions, and that means our interpretation is much more predictable because we're the only ones who provided you evidence. That's exactly why the counterinterpretation always has to be carded. And they can't just be ordinary cards. They have to be good cards. They have to have an intent to define the words that the 1C defined. They have to be precise too, have good qualifications, and those precision terms I already explained earlier. Next, you need reasons to prefer your counterinterpretation, just like the negative had reasons to prefer their interpretation. These are the AF standards, and why our model is good, which is the offense that you'll be relying on in the 1AR and the 2AR. Essentially, they're based off of the counterinterpretation, and that means your AF standards on topicality are only as good as your card on the counterinterpretation. First is predictability. 90% of the time, this is what the 1AR and the 2AR will go for. They're saying that the affirmative's counterinterpretation is far more predictable than the neg's interpretation. It essentially guides debates better and provides a better model for debates to revolve around over the course of the season. Think of this like the neg standard on precision, but more advanced and more all-encompassing. Second is another standard, which I personally think is worse, but sometimes teams will go for this, especially against particularly abusive T interpretations. It's called AF ground, or you'll also see it written as overlimiting. It essentially says that removing our AF is bad for fairness because it means that there's now only a tiny list of affirmatives that we can read under the negative's interpretation, and that now we're easily beaten by the negative because they have these great off-case positions that they can read compared to our minuscule advantage ground. Next, you have functional limits. This is a defensive argument. Never rely on this for offense because it is defense, not a standard. It essentially says that other factors check any potential limit to explosion or an increase in the number of Fs that can be read. Essentially, you're saying that there's either other positions that can be read or other extraneous things within the resolution that checks the number of possible Fs that can be read. For example, one argument that you'll see is the literature-based checks. For example, under the intellectual property topic, most apps have to be tied to innovation because if they're not, there's not very many good ways how they could actually get an extinction impact off of that. That's one example as to how the lit base can check. Next, you can argue that other off-case positions that can be applied toward almost every single bucket of F, like cap K, core quadrier, patents bed, are other positions that you can still read, even if the Fs under our counter-interpretation become the debate meta. Then, this statement essentially functions like a even if statement almost, because you're saying that even if limits increase, it doesn't doom the negative because they still have XYZ things to say against your affirmative, or there are XYZ constraining factors that prevent a massive explosion in the number of Fs. Next, you can say reasonability. Once again, this is a defensive argument, not a standard. However, it's a really good framing device because you're phrasing like topicality as an opportunity cost. Think of the debates that we could be having if we're not talking about topicality. This is a way to put the burden back on the negative by saying it's your burden to prove that we're so egregiously untopical that we should not be talking about our affirmative in the first place. Because ideally, it'd be more educational, more productive to actually talk about the resolution of intellectual property rights instead of just talking about topicality, functional limits, predictability, precision, limits, and the whole shebang. Essentially, this is a way and a mechanism to evaluate interpretations against each other and can sometimes serve as a useful tiebreaker when things are really close. But definitely don't rely on it on itself. I would also advise pairing it with pieces of defense like functional limits. Here's a quick example of a 2AC on topicality. This is about like an average length 2AC. Sometimes you'll see it shorter or maybe even more cards on it. First is the counter interpretation. Here's the Ostergaard card in response to the T no courts 1 and C I showed you earlier, saying that strengthening the IPR can include enforcement. As you see here, it redefines the word strengthening, which is defined in the 1 and C. Remember how I was talking about earlier, how you always need to counter define the words that were defined in the 1 and C? Well, this 2AC does exactly that. It redefines the word strengthening so that you can have some inroads into explaining how your interpretation is more predictable and more apt to guide a season's worth of debates. However, what's interesting about this 2AC on T is that it doesn't mention we mate. Ideally, this is something that you always throw in. However, there are certain circumstances that you wouldn't. For example, if there's an agent counterpun that you're particularly scared about, which I'll do a separate lecture on later, then you might not want to include we meet because sometimes they can concede the we meet argument and use that as a premise for counterpun competition. Just ignore that for now, but it's something to keep in mind. Next, the 2 argument you see is precision. You're arguing that their evidence is comparatively way worse than theirs because IPR protection and enforcement are distinct does not mean that IPR protection can't be done by the courts. Third is the over-limiting argument we were talking about earlier and how it just excludes all courts acts and Congress acts by their very nature are very small. Fourth is a functional limits argument. Fifth is affinivation. I didn't really boil that down for you earlier, but essentially says that their clash gets stale because it defines the number of affirmatives that we could be discussing. Think of this just as an extension of the over-limiting argument I already did earlier. And then there's reasonability at the end. Finally, we move on to extending topicality in the block. First, You'll want to start with a short overview, which is roughly 10 to maybe 15 seconds, that briefly extends the interpretation and the violation, but once again, keep it short. Next, you'll want to line blind the 2AC. So earlier, you do a 2AC1, the counter interpretation, 2AC2, predictability, 2AC3, over limiting, 2AC4, functional limits, and then just tilde it in your blocks accordingly. In response to we meet, 99% of the time, like mostly, affirmatives don't meet the T interpretation that you're reading, but in the rare case that they factually do meet your T interpretation, just don't extend it in the block. It'll just be a waste of your time, and the one error can easily brush it off. In response to the plain text in a vacuum argument I was talking about earlier, you have to argue that text focus explicitly is bad, and that it justifies obviously untopical Fs. For example, with plain text in a vacuum, if that were to become the standard, the affirmative could read an F that's like, the United States federal government should strengthen its protection of domestic intellectual property and patents by increasing its cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Technically, that's plain text in a vacuum topical, but functionally, that's like not actually topical. That's the kind of bad model that plain text in a vacuum justifies. That's why you want to say that it mixes burdens and text focus is on net less educational and less fair. Next, you'll want to extend your standards in offense while you're answering the counterinterpretation. For here, since the counterinterpretation is 2AC1, you'll just, on 2AC1, the counterinterpretation, extend reasons why your interpretation is more limited and why that's good and why it outweighs every piece of alpha offense. One of the key things here is that you can't just extend your offense. You have to do some impact calculus and comparison as to how under-limiting outweighs any marginal loss in predictability that the affirmative will argue. For example, the limits explosion and the increases of possible Fs make debates inherently unpredictable, which essentially turns the F arguments that they'll make against you. Next, you'll want to do the evidence comparison that I was talking about earlier in the 2AC response to T, but now for the negative. You're just going to explain why your evidence is better and how it's more precise, essentially. In response to predictability, this is where you want to put a lot of eggs in your basket, because this is what the 1AR and the 2AR will likely go for, or this is what they'll go for if they're a half-decent team. You have to explain why your evidence is more predictable, and this essentially gives you inroads into their offense. If they drop your warrants why your evidence is more predictable, it's game over, GG's. You can just concede that your interpretation, or you can just say that they conceded that your interpretation is more predictable, your cards are more precise, they have better qualifications, and that means it's a pretty easy win from there. However, if they don't make that major screw up, you'll want to argue that limits control predictability. Let's say that there's an inherently unlimited topic. If you could read like the fiscal redistribution asked on this topic, there's no way to determine what will actually be read. This means you can't actually predict anything that will actually be read, which means a limits explosion or an increase in the possible affirmatives control predictability. Next, you'll argue that even though you can pretty easily ascertain what limits there are and the scope of their limits, is far, far harder to ascertain the relative predictability between interpretations and gauge the relative predictability in those interpretations. You'll argue that it's a sliding scale, and any means that your interpretation and your evidence is also predictable means that it is predictable, and therefore we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We should be willing to sacrifice some degree of predictability if that means that we can foster a better topic for debate that will produce better debates over the course of the season. Next, if you have the time for this, you should also read more definitions, redefining words you didn't already define. Don't bother defining words that you already defined, because that's just a waste of time and generally is just redundant. In response to the over-limiting argument, you'll want to explain what the ground is under your interpretation. Provide a case list of potential affirmatives that they can read in future rounds under your interpretation. Then provide positions that the negative can read against the case list that you just gave. This will paint a picture in the judge's mind as to what type of debates will be generated under your model, and this will make the judge far more persuaded to vote for you because they know that the kind of debates that will be generated under your model are far more predictable and beneficial than the debates that will be generated under the affirmative model. Next, you'll want to explain why underlimiting outweighs predictability, because you're essentially losing every single generic you have because there's now a litany of unpredictable AFs because of an underlimited topic. By contrast, the only thing that the affirmative really loses is advantage ground, so therefore, losing every piece of negative ground obviously outweighs a tiny decrease in affirmative ground. In response to the functional limits check, the essential gist of your argument is that limits explosion non-unique sit. I know this is in debater talk right now, but put simply, that means that the affirmative makes going for other off-case positions impossible, because under their interpretation, our functional limits become wholly insufficient to check their affirmatives. Because if it's impossible to win a clog link, Patent's bad doesn't work against their AF because it's a copyright AF, and the CapK loses to framework, then there becomes no real thing that you can go for against their affirmative. Otherwise, you can also argue that functional limits are bad, because going for the same 3 off-case positions becomes very stale. I don't advise going for this because it isn't really an argument that mitigates their defense, it just proves why functional limits are bad. Another argument that I think is pretty good is that functional limits inherently fail. Any 2A with half a brain cell essentially will just write specific link terms premised on that specific affirmative. The reason why teams like to break new affirmatives, especially bigger teams like to, is because they give you new strategies that they can execute against the types of functional limits like the CapK, banned patents counterplan, and the politics DA that a lot of teams like to read. That's exactly why. When a topic has such a massive literature base, like the intellectual property topic does, functional limits oftentimes fail. Next, in response to reasonability, you're obviously arguing first and foremost that they're not reasonable. That was all of your offense you already did above. But even if they win that, reasonability is inherently arbitrary. Judges will now do whatever they want to now because they themselves already agreed that predictability matters. There's no way to predict how reasonability will be applied or what judges think what is reasonable or what's not reasonable. Next, you want to argue that competing interpretations or comparing the interpretation to the counter-interpretation is better because it rewards better technical debating, better comparison, and better research that fosters a season's worth of better debates in the long run. I hope this was an insightful presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and don't hesitate to email me with more questions. Thank you.